Depth had returned to psychology. The unconscious spoke. Stories mattered. Meaning re-entered the room, but something remained unresolved. Therapy could take years. Interpretations multiplied. Insight did not always lead to change. Patients understood themselves, yet continued to suffer. Once again, psychology asked a familiar question. What actually works? Behaviorism had tried to erase the mind. It failed. But it left behind something important. Discipline, structure, and a demand for evidence. When psychology turned back toward inner life, it did so cautiously. The mind was allowed back in, but only if it could be studied systematically. Thus began the cognitive revolution. In the mid-20th century, psychology began to view the mind not as a black box, but as an information processing system. Perception, memory, attention, interpretation all became legitimate objects of study. The metaphor shifted. The mind was no longer a machine of reflexes. It was a processor of meaning. This change reopened the door to philosophy, especially epistemology and theories of knowledge. How do we know what we know? How do we interpret reality? These were philosophical questions in scientific clothing. Albert Ellis was impatient. He saw clients who understood their past perfectly, yet remained trapped in self-criticism and emotional turmoil. Ellis believed suffering often came from rigid internal demands. I must succeed. Others must approve of me. Life must be fair. These demands acted like harsh laws written into the psyche. Ellis's rational emotive behavior therapy challenged them directly. Not gently, not symbolically, but clearly. His philosophy echoed the Stoics. We are disturbed not by events, but by our beliefs about them. Ellis brought philosophy back into therapy, but stripped of metaphysics and poetry. Where Ellis confronted, Aaron Beck observed. Working with depressed patients, Beck noticed patterns, automatic thoughts that appeared instantly and felt unquestionably true. I'm a failure. This will never change. There's no point. These thoughts were not conclusions. They were reflexes. Beck realized that emotion follows interpretation. Cognitive therapy helped people notice these thoughts, test them, soften their grip. The mind in this view is not an enemy. It is a narrator, sometimes unreliable. Therapy becomes the practice of listening more carefully. Cognitive behavioral therapy combined cognition and behavior. It offered clear models, defined goals, time-limited treatment, measurable outcomes. For many, this was liberating. Suffering became understandable. Change felt possible. CBT worked especially well for anxiety, depression, phobias, compulsive patterns. Psychology regained credibility, not just as interpretation, but as intervention. CBT's success was undeniable, but success created blind spots. Not all suffering is cognitive distortion. Not all pain is irrational. Not all meaning can be reframed. Trauma, grief, existential despair, these resisted simple restructuring. For some clients, CBT felt invalidating, as if their pain were a thinking error rather than a human response. Once again, psychology approached a limit. As CBT spread, philosophical questions resurfaced. Is symptom reduction enough? Is well-being merely the absence of distress? What about values, purpose, and identity? Existential philosophy reminded psychology. Humans do not only want relief, they want meaning. Eastern traditions add another layer. Control is not always the answer. Acceptance sometimes heals what effort cannot. Psychology stood at another crossroads. The field began to shift. Instead of asking, how do we eliminate symptoms? A new question emerged. How do humans relate to their inner experience? This question would lead to mindfulness-based approaches, acceptance-based therapies, compassion-focused work. Control gave way, slowly, to relationship. The last part represents psychology's attempt to regain balance through structure and cognition. It brought clarity where chaos reigned. It offered tools where despair dominated. But it also revealed a deeper truth. Human suffering is not only a technical problem, it is a relational, existential, and ethical one. At a certain point, psychology began to slow down, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded and noticed the limits of success. Symptoms could be reduced, behaviors could be changed, thoughts could be challenged, and yet many people still felt lost. Something essential was missing. The question quietly changed again. Not, how do we fix the mind, but how do we live with it? This final part explores the moment when psychology begins to consciously integrate philosophy, not as theory, but as orientation. For much of its modern history, psychology treated the mind as something to be managed. Thoughts were corrected, emotions were regulated, behaviors were shaped. This approach helped millions, but it also carried an implicit assumption that inner experience is a problem to be solved. Gradually, a different perspective emerged. What if suffering is not always a malfunction? What if discomfort is sometimes information? What if the problem's not experience itself, but the struggle against it? These questions echo ancient philosophy, but now they returned in clinical form. Mindfulness-based approaches mark one of the clearest points of integration between Eastern philosophy and Western psychology. In mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, awareness becomes the central skill. Not awareness to control, awareness to notice. Thoughts are seen as events, emotions as movements, the self as a process rather than an object. The metaphor shifts. The mind is no longer a machine to repair. It is a landscape to inhabit. This echoes Buddhist psychology, but translated carefully into secular, trauma-aware language. The goal is not transcendence, it is balance. Acceptance and commitment therapy deepens this shift. ACT begins with an honest observation. Pain is unavoidable. Loss, fear, uncertainty, they are part of being human. Suffering increases when life becomes organized around avoidance. ACT introduces a different orientation. Acceptance instead of resistance, values instead of certainty, commitment instead of control. The metaphor here is not healing as repair, but healing as movement. Life is not something to solve. It is something to walk through, sometimes with weight, sometimes without. ACT draws from behavioral science, existential philosophy, mindfulness traditions. It does not promise relief first, it promises direction. Alongside mindfulness and acceptance, humanistic psychology regained importance. Figures like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow had already emphasized empathy, authenticity, unconditional positive regard, but their ideas gained new relevance in an era saturated with techniques. Humanistic psychology reminds the field of something simple and radical. People heal in relationships, not through correction alone, not through insight alone, but through being seen without judgment. This insight is philosophical as much as psychological. It echoes Aristotle's emphasis on character, existential philosophies focus on authenticity, dialogical traditions that see selfhood as relational. As psychology integrates philosophy, ethics quietly returns. What is mental health? What kind of life are we helping people build? Is adaptation always desirable? Psychology can teach coping. Philosophy asks whether what we are coping for is worth it. These questions matter. In a world that often rewards speed, productivity, and compliance, psychology must ask whether symptom reduction alone is enough. Integration demands responsibility. Modern neuroscience adds another layer. The brain is plastic. The nervous system is shaped by experience. Trauma leaves traces in the body. These findings support many ancient insights. The body and mind are inseparable. Repetition shapes character. Safety precedes reflection. At the same time, neuroscience introduces humility. No single model explains everything. No theory captures the whole person. Complexity resists domination. Today, the boundary between philosophy and psychology is thinner than it has been in centuries. Psychologists study meaning, values, consciousness, morality. Philosophers engage with cognition, emotion, embodiment, mental health. The separation that once seemed necessary now feels artificial. Not everything can be measured. Not everything should be. Perhaps the deepest shift is this. The mind is no longer treated primarily as an obstacle. It is a companion, sometimes helpful, sometimes misleading, always human. Philosophy teaches how to ask questions of the mind. Psychology teaches how to respond to its suffering. Together they suggest a gentler stance, not mastery, not submission, but dialogue. This journey began in ancient philosophy, where the mind was inseparable from life itself. It passed through science, where the mind was measured, divided, and controlled. And it returns, not backward but deeper, to a place where understanding and care meet. Psychology without philosophy risks becoming technique without direction. Philosophy without psychology risks becoming insight without grounding. Together, they form something older than both disciplines, a human attempt to live with clarity, meaning, and less unnecessary suffering, not by eliminating the mind, but by learning how to listen to it. As we come to the end of this journey, it becomes clear that psychology and philosophy were never truly separate. They were two ways of asking the same human questions, one through reflection and meaning, the other through observation and care. Across centuries, we tried to understand the mind by dividing it, measuring it, fixing it. And again, we discovered the same truth. The mind is not just something we have. It is something we live with. Philosophy reminds us why these questions matter. Psychology helps us respond when they become painful. Together, they don't give us final answers, but they offer orientation, humility, and compassion. If this series has shown anything, it is that understanding the mind is not about mastering it, but about learning how to relate to it more wisely. Behind this narrator is a real human being, still curious, still learning, still asking these questions. Thank you for taking the time to walk this path. And take care. Are there specific topics you're interested in or a particular question you'd like answered in your life? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe now and join me on your journey toward more clarity and inner strength.